Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project between the U.S. chapter of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. I'm Alex Vizi, one of the series organizers, along with Kimberly Mack, Elena Razlogova, Francesca Royster, Gus Statler, Eric Weisbard, and Carl Wilson. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal tab. You can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including our latest session in which Allison Bumstead and Peter Richardson discussed their new books on Teen Set and Rolling Stone magazine. We will return Wednesday, December 17th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time for Punk Week. Ellen Bernard, Stefano Morello, and David Pearson will be discussing their new anthology, NoFX 40 Years of Problematic Punk Provocations. They will be joined by Brigitte Davidians and Tyler Sonicson, who will be talking about their books on JMKE and the Dead Milkmen. But today, we're talking about the charts. Years ago, Chris Dalla Riva decided that he was going to listen to every number one hit in the history of the Billboard Hot 100. Because he works on analytics for the music streaming service AudioMac, he started building a giant data set focused on all of the number one hits that he was listening to. Using that information, he wrote a data-driven history of popular music covering the period from 1958 to 2025. Because data analysis is more powerful with visualization, Dalla Riva teamed up with graphic designer Caileigh Nerney to bring this numerical history to life. Published in November 2025 via Bloomsbury, this collaboration turned into Uncharted Territory, what numbers tell us about the biggest hit songs and ourselves. The book has been covered by CNN and Rolling Stone, along with a slew of podcasts and newsletters. This presentation will focus on how to use data to understand popular culture and how to best visualize that data. A few more words about our presenters. Chris Dalla Riva lives at the intersection of music and data. Playing in bands and recording music since his teenage years, Dalla Riva is currently a senior product manager at AudioMac, where he focuses on data analytics and personalization. Outside of his job, he writes the popular newsletter Can't Get Much Higher and has had his work featured by The Economist, Business Insider, and NPR, among many others. His original claim to fame was setting off an internet-wide debate about the decline of key changes in popular music. He currently lives in Hoboken, New Jersey, with his 4 guitars and future wife, Devin. Caileigh Nerney is a graphic designer and artist with a passion for transforming complex information into compelling visual narratives. Her expertise spans infographics, branding, and visual identity, with a focus on making information both accessible and engaging. Her work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, NBC, and exhibited at the Connor Smith Gallery. She lives in New Jersey with her husband, her greatest supporter and creative sounding board, and is deeply grateful to her family for their unwavering encouragement of her artistic journey. During their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat. And in the last part of the session, Eric Weisbard will call on you to unmute and ask your questions during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation. And now, Chris and Caileigh.
Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us. Let me share my screen, and hopefully can everyone see this? Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we'll reiterate, I mean, some stuff that was just shared. But today we're going to talk about data, visualization, and popular music. Again, this is from the book that I just wrote, Uncharted Territory, what numbers tell us about the biggest hit songs and ourselves. We just got the big old introduction, so I won't go through that again, but this is me and Caileigh, who you'll hear more from in a couple minutes. She did all of the illustrations, graphic design for the interior of this book. So again, I said I'll reiterate what was just said, but and I'm not sure why I put this in third person, but I guess I wasn't thinking that I would read it. But in 2017, I decided that I was going to listen to every song to ever get to the top of the Billboard Hot 100. This wasn't a terrible, terrible shock. I've always played in bands. I've always enjoyed writing songs and stuff. So I thought this would be at least an educational journey. And I decided to do one song per day, and I would just come home from work. At the time, I wasn't working in the music industry, I was working consulting, come home from work, look up whatever the next number one was, listen to it a couple times, maybe play along on my guitar. And it took a little bit over 3 years to get through all of those songs. But as we noted, my training is with data, statistics, analytics. So as I was going through, I started to track some facts and figures about these songs. Initially, it was really simple stuff. I would just like rate the song between 1 and 10, and I just wanted somewhere to track all my ratings. But then slowly over time, this data set began to expand into a pretty big behemoth, which is available online and which afterwards I can put in the chat. You could probably go crazy with it. But some stuff that's in there is about the release, when did the music come out? How many weeks was it number one? What label put it out? Some of it is contextual. Was the song written for a movie, a television show, or play? Is it associated with some sort of dance? I tracked a ton of different demographic data about artists, songwriters, and producers. I tried to focus on age, race, and gender. I looked at things specific to the songs. Does the song have samples? Does it fade out? What's the structure of the song? Is it a verse chorus structure? Does it use some other song structure? A few things about lyrics. I tried to categorize the lyrical topic. Was there a narrative in the lyrics? Was it telling some sort of story? What language was it in? Was there any explicit content? And of course, what was going on in the music? Some high level stuff about the key, time signature, BPM, but I also pulled in a ton of stuff from Spotify, which has a lot of analytics about what is going on within a song. So as you can, this is sort of just a sample of the data, but as you can see, it's pretty much all over the place. And I use that to write what I think is what I call a data-driven history of popular music. So this book is in part about my listening journey, but it's also about using numbers and analytics to try to understand the history of popular music, to interrogate the stories that we often hear, to see if they are true or if they hold up to statistical scrutiny. Um, but as I joke in the acknowledgments of the book, uh, you know, data analytics without good visualization is like Elton John without Bernie Taupin. It works, but not as well as it should. So I invited my friend Caileigh to design all the graphics in this book, and we're going to go through just a handful of them, or as many as we have time for. But I believe we ended up having just around 60 graphics in this book, so it was a pretty monumental undertaking for her, and it was a very nice collaboration. And the goal was, again, to bring these numbers to life because, a lot of people are scared of numbers, and we didn't want that in this book. We want it to be digestible to anyone, whether they had numerical training or not. We had a few guiding philosophy points that I just wanted to go through, and then we'll actually start doing some of the fun stuff, looking at the graphics. We want to be accurate. Like I said, I work with data, and accuracy is the top thing that I care about. Of course, sometimes you want a graphic that looks nice and pretty, but if it distorts whatever the data was saying, we were not going to use it. At the same time, we want it to be playful. This is a book about not just pop songs, but the most popular pop songs. And pop songs often are fun. They're sometimes silly. So we thought the graphics, as long as they were accurate, should also be fun. And you'll see some of that as we go through. And we want to be informative. We don't want to overload the graphics with information, but we sort of want them to be able to stand on their own so that even if you don't have the complete context of the book, you could still take something away from these graphics. So basically what Caileigh and I wanted to do is go through a bunch of these graphics. I will give you some context about what I'm talking about in the book related to this graphic, and then she will touch on the design philosophy here and what we were going for. So first, this is a fun chart about twists on the Billboard Hot 100. This occurs in the first chapter, and the goal here was primarily to document the twist craze, but also to illustrate how musical fads generally work. A fad emerges, everyone starts, everyone participates in that fad to some degree, and then it dies pretty quickly. Uh, I tracked this just by looking for songs with the word twist in the title on the Billboard Hot 100. And this is actually the first graphic in the book, and I will now hand it over to Caileigh to tell you about her thoughts
Sure.
on this.
Yeah, so from the start, we kind of approach this with building a consistent brand, I'd call it, for all of the charts. So you'll see as they go through, we're using the same, fonts, general style. But as it came chart by chart, we were really trying to figure out like what is the best graphic or visualization we can add to speak to each chart individually. So some of them have like a simple graphic. Some of them are really involved with the graphic. Others just have a few call outs along the way. So we really try to keep that in mind for each of like not needing to have, if one has a graphic, everything needs a really involved graphic. It was about how do we best communicate exactly what this chart is trying to communicate. So again, with this one, like Chris said, it's about like a very specific trend. So just adding a little bit of a twist up on that, you know, big as all the twists came up the chart was enough to give it something fun that would catch a reader's eye and pull them in a little bit without, distracting too much from the overall point of the chart.
Yeah, and this is something and I also like to situate these as usually they were about something specific, but also it could illustrate something larger. And again, the context of the book is we're talking about how music ages or how things come and go, and the twist is a perfect example of this. Jump forward to this one, and this is also a chapter later, but showing a similar trend is something that became popular in a very short period of time and then disappeared rather quickly. We're talking specifically about surf rock, and this is an interesting graphic because there's not a ton analytically going on, but I will let Caileigh touch about how we fit all of this information in here. And all we did data-wise was we were just looking for songs either by Dick Dale or that had surf in the artist's name or the song title.
Yeah. So obviously this one's speaking to a bit more of like a novelty music genre that was coming and going. So it allowed more for a novelty chart to go with it. It's less focused on needing to communicate like hard dates and numbers and more just on communicating the feel of like what was going on culturally and musically at the time. So that allowed us to have a little bit more fun with it. And really the way that the surf rock came in was like very quick all at once, got really big, and then fell right off like a wave. So when you think about how that would stack visually, it really allowed for this shape. So it's certain things we were able to have a little bit more fun with that needed to be less like in the weeds, in the numbers, and just communicate like a feeling and a vibe. So yeah, definitely a fun one.
Yeah, and this is something we set out to do throughout the book is we really wanted to, we wanted to talk about larger trends, but we also wanted to capture these little scenes that may have just been popular for a couple years. The surf rock is, of course, a great example of that. Jump forward to the third chapter here, and this is earlier I said we wanted to use the book to investigate certain ideas that, I feel like I often hear about when people talk about music and to see if they held up to any statistical scrutiny. In this case, this chart is showing the percentage of number one hits that were written or produced by the performing artist. As I felt like someone growing up listening to popular music, I was taught or I implicitly learned that this was an idea that really emerged in the 1960s with the Beatles and Bob Dylan and the like. And you definitely see that after the Beatles hit in the US, there is a surge in artists who are writing and producing their own songs. And I take this chart actually before back to the pre-Hot 100 era, all the way to 1940. What I think is interesting is we see a surge in artists writing and producing their own songs in the lead up to the Beatles coming to America. And I think this is nice because it sort of situates the Beatles as part of a larger musical landscape. And I'm sure everyone here knows more about the Beatles than they'll ever need to. But, the Beatles influences Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Eddie Cochran, Buddy Holly. These were guys that were also writing their own songs. And I thought I really liked showing this chart because it shows that this typical narrative we hear about how popular music works isn't completely accurate. And really, this trend starts about a decade before the Beatles hit in the US. And Caileigh can jump in.
Yeah. So this is obviously a bit of our more like standard formula for a chart as we went through the book. And one thing I thought was really helpful as we approached this project was Chris didn't just give me the data, but he would give me the chapters like as he had it written. So I would read the chapter before I started on the chart just to really be able to approach it from that point of view of a reader. And Chris breaks the book down. His chapters go by eras that he's defined, like musically, based on whatever trends and things he'll be talking about. And one of the things I found from the beginning was that as he'd be referencing an era later in a chapter, I would find myself like flipping back and forth to the front page to see like what exactly were the dates we're talking about here. So when we were approaching the charts, I thought it would be helpful both to hammer in the errors that Chris is speaking about, but also as a reference point to the reader to add this current era bar onto the charts. So if he's talking about how after the Beatles this trend went up, you can see exactly in the era we're talking about in the chapter, like where are we talking about in the chart. Again, it's just like another entryway to help ground a viewer in approaching a chart in a way that is really understandable and readable. So that was one thing just to call out here how we came to that decision.
Yeah, and another thing I'm sure Caileigh will touch on later is when I first realized this book was going to get published, in my head I assumed all the graphics would be in color, which I very quickly found out would not be the case. So that was another challenge that she would have. Whereas, if this was in color, we would probably have the lines as different colors, and you'll see how she had to grapple with that later. But here you see just two lines, one's dotted or dashed, the other's solid. Um, and you will see a little bit more of that as we go on. This is one of, I think, one of Kayleigh's favorite charts, and she'll talk about this in a second. Here we're talking in the 70s, as you can see, this current era idea comes up again, and you'll see that in most of the charts, is how often were songs at number one on average. And throughout the 60s, it's usually sits between 2 and 3 weeks. And then in the early 1970s, this absolutely tanks, and you're seeing a ton of turnover at the top of the charts. In the context of the book, which I won't go completely into here, is that think there were some shenanigans going on where Billboard or some fraudulent behavior where Billboard wasn't being completely accurate in putting together their charts. And because of that, you see some anomalous behavior in the data, one of which is this, is you suddenly see songs topping the charts for much shorter periods. And I go through a couple other things in the book, like the overlap between Billboard and Cashbox, and try to suss out when this weird fraudulent behavior inside of Billboard started and when it ended. But Caileigh could talk about this giant foam finger now.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I like this one so much is the imagery here, I think, is not purely decorative. It's also really hammering in the trends that he's talking about and how they're physically shifting the data and the line. So how, when you're having a song like Hey Jude top the charts for 9 weeks in a row, that is like literally going to lift the average up and change the way that this is being tracked. Versus when you have 12 weeks in a row, it is going to weigh down the chart immediately. So I think it just really shows, these like trends and other things culturally happening are actually having a real effect on the numbers. It's not just like a clean system that's tracked evenly all the time. All these outside forces can like literally shift the lines up and down. And I think, the graphics add to showing that push and pull.
Yeah, I mean the book is ultimately about song, so we do like to remind people that that's what's underneath the lines and the images. Jump forward to, oh, this is also in the 1970s. This is not when I talk about this book, not a visualization I typically share because I think it's one of the more complicated ones, but I thought the people here might enjoy it. I wanted to track song structure over the years and specifically the rise of the verse chorus structure. When I was writing this chapter, it was during the Christmas season, and luckily right now it's during the Christmas season. So I gave examples of like, oh, what's a song in the verse chorus form? And I named a Christmas song for each of these. The only thing here that might not make complete sense to people is this structure called verse mid. This was a name I concocted for reasons that I specify in the book, but the reason I did well, I should say, this is the song structure that's sometimes called like AABA or the Great American Song Form. Uh, you know, Over the Rainbow by Judy Garland is of this form, Yesterday by the Beatles, all that stuff. And what we really wanted to show here was the verse chorus form supplants this, what I call the verse mid form, or verse middle eight form, during the 1960s and the 1970s. But I'll let this is not exactly how it's displayed in the book, but I'll let Caileigh jump in to talk about what it was like dealing with all of these lines and information in one graphic.
Yeah, definitely, like you said, a lot of the choices we made in some ways were shaped by the form of the book. So how much space do we have working in black and white, et cetera. So again, being that we had to fit so much into this one graphic, you don't want to overcomplicate it by adding in a lot of extra information. This one was clearly we just wanted to keep a top line so people could get what they needed to out of it. The one thing we did add is I don't believe originally we had the Christmas songs written like under the title of the chart, and we added them in afterward. Again, approaching with like the mind of a reader and me who does not have as much of a music mind as Chris does. It'd be easy to kind of look at that and be like, I don't really know what it means. I'm just skipping the page. So we were always trying to add something in that would like pull a reader's eye and give them something approachable to make them feel like, you can get you can connect with this chart in an immediate way, a song that pops into your head and helps you immediately understand it. So that was an ad we put in to make it a bit more accessible.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's something, like I said at the beginning, I want this book to be accessible to people who, are scared of algebra or not. In the same way, we want it to be accessible to people who know all the songs or not. So that's a great point. Disco, we're in the late 70s now, and this is a two for you to two for here, two graphics. I wanted to track the rise and fall of disco, and I tie this to Disco Demolition Night and everything that was going on in the late 70s. But the way we decided to track the rise of disco was just through words appearing in in song titles on the Hot 100. I don't have them all listed here, but I was just looking for songs that had words like dance, shake, boogie, booty, and a few other things in the title. And what you see is this is relatively consistent throughout the last 65 years, except during the height of the disco era. But of course, we're showing yearly data right here. We wanted to also zoom in. So this is the chart that comes after. And you can see week by week in 1979 how often song titles, or what percentage of song titles on the Hot 100 had these words in them. And you can see the slow, or not slow, this pretty relatively sudden death of disco. The point that I make here is that disco popularity was declining before the infamous Disco Demolition Night occurs. And I think often we just historically we overstate like single events changing the course of a movement or a musical style. So I wanted to show that a little bit here, that the trajectory of disco was on the descent before this crazed event even occurred. And let Caileigh talk about these fun graphics here.
Yeah. So yeah, obviously we're into disco music. It's fun. You want something like fun, lively. The disco ball, mashing it with the wrecking ball for disco demolition night. Again, it's just something that makes a chart feel more approachable to somebody, catches their eye, draws them in, makes them look at it, a little bit longer, pull some of that extra info out. And I think on the disco demolition too, this one also has the same feel a little bit of the foam finger one where it's decorative, but it's also really hammering in the like disco demolition night being the cause or not, there really was this like collapse on the chart. So it kind of gives that like sudden hit and fall feeling to hammer in the trend that Chris was discussing in the chapter around it.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. We'll move to the 1980s here. And here we wanted to catalog how MTV catalyzed the second British invasion, which, a bunch of synthy British bands were on the charts in the 1980s. And what I think many people don't realize or forget at least is that this second invasion on the charts was actually larger than the first British invasion that occurs during the 1960s. And relatively simple chart here. I mean, we just have a line, but I think little decorative elements make it pop.
Yeah, definitely. This is just more strictly decorative. They're not really adding anything to the analysis here, but it's just something fun. You're the first Brit to top the charts. You get to plant the flag at the top. Like it's just adds a little bit of visual interest, a place to like rest the eye for the reader.
Cool. We'll keep moving. So 1990s, like I said earlier, one thing I was very keen on tracking were demographic trends. In this chart here, you're going to see demographic trends for artists, but at other points in the book, which hopefully we'll be able to get to, we do the same for producers and songwriters. And one thing I'll point out in this chart is it says SoundScan era begins. And SoundScan was a new way for Billboard to track their charts. Before that, Billboard was basically just calling up record stores and being like, hey, what's selling? Which is a perfectly valid way to track a chart, but it's obviously subject to error. Whereas SoundScan, Billboard was getting direct data from retailers when they would scan a barcode. of a CD or a cassette or a record. So suddenly the charts became more accurate, and overnight things changed pretty dramatically. There was more alternative rock, hip hop, and country to some degree on the charts. But at the same time, this was not just genre based. We also saw that broadly black artists and minority artists were being undercounted on the charts before the sound scan change. And this is something that I highlight in the book. Black artists had complained about for decades. There's a great quote in a Motown, not biography, a book about Motown that I read where Marvin Gaye is seething about this because he's saying, Billboard is not calling the record stores that our records sell best in. And you can really see that here is overnight, suddenly there are many more black artists on the charts. And we wanted to highlight, a couple superstars here. Um, but yeah, I don't know, Caileigh, if you have anything else to add here.
Yeah, one thing it just how we said kind of we approached it chart by chart is on a lot of them when you're dealing with like demographics and things like race or gender, these charts aren't really going to be served by adding like a simple fun graphic to them. That's not going to add anything interesting to them. But what does add something interesting is these call outs. When you read like Motown, Michael Jackson, Tupac, obviously these are huge artists, but they also their work had like was connected to pop culture and politics and fashion and all these other things at the time. So when a reader sees this, it helps place them like in time culturally and understand how these trends went along with cultural trends and moments much more than just like reading the date at the bottom of the chart would. So in this case, like this was kind of the most helpful thing to add to bring this chart to life.
Yeah, definitely. I think we got one other from the 90s. This I'll need to give a little bit of context on. So a lot of chapter 9 in the book, I focus on what changed after Billboard switched to SoundScan. And one thing that I wanted to investigate was were songs more or less similar, or like were the charts more or less homogenous after this change came about? And I don't have the full graphic or analysis here because it goes on a little bit too long to talk about. But one way I tried to do this was to look at uh, six pieces of data. Five of these come from Billboard, not Billboard. Five of these come from Spotify because they scan all the audio files on the platform. And the sixth one, instrumentalness, is just what percentage of the song does not have vocals. And I tasked Caileigh with trying to figure out a way to display this in a way where you could see how these things actually related, songs being more or less similar. So we just picked out three songs here. Cream by Prince, I'll Take You There by the Staple Singers, and You Don't Bring Me Flowers by Neil Diamond and Barbra Streisand. And the point was ultimately that I'll Take You There is more similar to Cream sonically, and You Don't Bring Me Flowers is less similar to those other two. But I'll let Caileigh touch on the fun visualization here.
Yeah, so this one it was kind of two parts. Is one you can see some of the challenges Chris was talking about that are just posed by like the form that you're working with. So working in like an only black and white form, how do we differentiate these three songs stacked on top of each other? So there was a lot of kind of trying out different shades, different shapes to see what differentiated them without getting too visually crowded. And then I think this is also like a different type of chart than people are used to seeing. They might at first kind of look at it and be taken aback. It's less approachable than a bar chart or a line chart, which people are more familiar with. So adding in these like simple emoji type graphics along the edge, just I think again makes a reader feel more of like, oh, I can understand that. I can get danceability, energy, happiness. It makes it simpler, more approachable, more of like an everyday thing somebody might interact with, as opposed to something that looks a little jarring and I'll just flip to the next page.
Yeah, we didn't want anyone flipping pages.
No.
Really engaging. And like I said, in the book, what we look at over time is this similarity score over time. This was a specific example of a couple songs, but I think one of the more inventive graphics. Here we make it to the 2000s, and in this chapter, part of it is focused around, the launch of Napster and how that affected the industry. And to show this, I just wanted to show industry revenues from the RIAA by year, and you can see all the different formats and how they contributed to, the rise, the fall, and the growth again of the music industry just in terms of revenues. But I will mostly let Kaylee touch on this because I think this was one of the more challenging graphics, but I think it ended up being one of the more powerful, tells a pretty complete story.
Yeah, yeah. So this was again definitely a challenge on how to like best represent this in black and white. So a lot of playing with the color, a lot of playing with where the text falls, and again, kind of beyond that, we didn't want to overcomplicate it by adding in a bunch of just decorative graphics. Really, the most helpful thing to add in were these, CD introduce, iTunes introduce, help place people in time as they're seeing, just to kind of correlate exactly when was this technology introduced and how is that affecting the sales as you go. So definitely it was like a complicated one, trying to fit everything in, give it its right place without feeling too crowded, which is why we made some choices like the current era bar is there, but we pulled current era, like the text of it off, just to give a little bit more breathing room to all of the information that we did want people to hone in on and take away.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this chart. I think it really tells, the story partially of the last 65, well, not 65 years, what, 50 years of popular music. And like I said, we're mostly in this chapter focusing on the legal troubles around Napster and the launch of iTunes, but you can see much more than that. This comes from the next chapter, and I know many of these ideas are like, why, how are these all connected? But I would definitely weave them together a little bit more carefully throughout the book. But I wanted to show this one, not just because I like the chart, but because in the introduction, I mentioned how my claim to internet fame was setting off a debate about the decline of key changes in popular music. And part of the reason I was able to get this book published was an article I published on a website called Tedium a couple of years ago, where I put this chart, except Kaylee didn't make it, so it was a lot uglier. But it showed basically the same thing that around 2000, you start to see a dramatic decline in the number of number one hits that have a key change. And this went mega viral. It's the most viral thing I've ever been involved with. I did a little segment on NPR about it, and people on YouTube were making videos about it. It was very, very strange. So I felt like I had to include this in the book in some capacity. In the context of the book, I'm talking about how this decline is connected to the rise of specific genres that seem to be less involved with harmonic experimentation, but also the way music being made had changed. People were recording music on computers, and as I argue in the book, I think that lends itself or doesn't lend itself to writing music with key changes as much as if you were, recording to a tape machine. I won't lay out the entire argument here, but this is, I think, still one of the more compelling charts, and I'll let Kaylee touch on some of the details she added here.
Yeah, this was like a tougher one for me. It was obviously how do you visualize a key change is a little bit harder than how do you visualize like surf rock or disco demolition. There's like less obvious graphics there, but after playing around with it a bit, kind of came up with the concept of using the lines of the chart like lines of sheet music and giving like a nod to the music lovers there who could read the music and just making it's simple, but it hammers home the topic that we're talking about and just adds a little bit of a fun nod.
Yeah. This is another one, comes from actually a little bit later in the same chapter. And again, like I said, I was very concerned with tracking the evolution of demographics to top the charts because I don't think you can really tell the history of popular music in any capacity without talking about the evolution of the race and age and gender of people who were making music. So here we simultaneously track two things. One is just the percentage of number one hits with at least one credited songwriter who is a woman. And secondly, the percentage of number one hits with a songwriter who is a woman, but who is also not the artist. And what I trace here is I first show this chart without the second dotted line, and it makes things look very, very rosy. We've achieved gender equality. But what you see and when you uh, dive into the research is that almost all of these credits are just the lead singer being credited on the song, which, is a great thing in its own right, but you still see women dramatically underrepresented in the songwriting community. And you almost never see, and I talk about this in the book, groups of men performing songs that are exclusively written by women, maybe outside of Aerosmith singing a Diane Warren song and a couple other examples. So again, this was I felt very strongly that I wanted to address some of these long-term demographic trends and suss out some of the subtlety. And I think we captured some of that here. And I don't know if Caileigh has anything to add.
Yeah, no, I think this is just kind of the same thing we spoke about before. Of like, the demographic charts weren't really going to be added to by adding a graphic, but including these call outs to, maybe some unsung women who weren't really getting acknowledgement of writing some of the biggest songs that you know at the time. And just adding that little call out and acknowledgement does add something, to bring this chart and make it more approachable.
Yeah, like we also mentioned earlier, we wanted these to be grounded in song so that you could
Mhm.
see one of these song names and think about it. And I think this is the last one we have. This is something you read about often. It comes up towards the end of the book, and part of the discussion is how technology shapes popular music. So you can see that throughout the 60s, the average number one hit becomes longer. And this is mostly just changes in vinyl technology. The 2 to 3 minute pop song was often driven by the fact that vinyl singles just couldn't hold more sound without degrading. We see that get longer, and that sits around 4 minutes for a couple decades. Then over the last decade, decade and a half, we begin to see songs get shorter. And the typical explanation is that the financial incentives of streaming make it such that shorter songs can get artists paid more. And one of the key themes throughout the book is that I think musical evolution is often downstream of technological innovation, and artists respond to technological and financial incentives. I don't think it's deterministic, but I wanted to track that in a couple charts, and this is one of them that shows that. And Caileigh, if there's anything else you want to add here.
Yeah, obviously this is another just decorative, a little fun note to put the chart right in that like iPod streaming setup. But it's not just decoration, like it grounds it in the trends and the conversation that's being had around it. So kind of serves 2 points there of like a visual reminder of exactly what we're discussing, as well as just something a little bit fun to draw the eye and get attention to it.
Yeah, so I think that's the last one we have, and we want to obviously open the floor to questions. Of course, like I said, this book sort of covers a bunch of disparate topics, and we sort of weave them together in what I think is a nice way. But I know we touched on a lot of stuff, and the book is out. I mean, you could go check it out if you would like, but we're happy to answer any questions that appeared in the chat now.
All right. I guess that's my moment to step in and thank you both for a really unique presentation in our history. It's the first time we've ever had a book retrospectively looked over through this specific lens. So we'll have to um, start with the questions we've gotten in. I'll encourage people to put more in the chat and we'll take it from there. Alex, you want to get us started?
Sure. I wanted to take up the point y'all made at the beginning of the presentation about wanting the graphics to be playful. I was curious if there were any like sight gags or, like when I think of playful, I think humor. And so I'm just curious if there are any like sight gags or like running jokes, visual gags in the book.
Uh, actually, there was. I don't think there are many. Kaylee can jump in and tell me if I'm missing something. I'd say that the tone of the book itself is pretty playful and jokey. I don't know if we have a ton of visual gags, though there is one. Of course, it's not here. I could go find it if we have to, where Kaylee replicates the Spider-Man meme online, where it's like two people pointing at each other. Which, if you're not familiar with that, I'm going to sound like I'm insane. I don't, which funny enough, I didn't notice, and then one
Yeah,
of my
Chris
friends.
didn't pick up on it. Yeah, no, I wouldn't say there's any like running like gags between them just because there are a lot of differences. But yeah, there is a chart talking about when we're in that like song similarity conversation. So yeah, it's kind of like two vinyl records pointing at each other like, hey, we're the same. And yeah, it's modeled after that um Spider-Man meme. So that would probably be the closest Sarah joke we've got there.
Cool. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. Chart Chris, meet chart Chris. Chris Melanthi, come on in.
Hello, Chris.
You're muted, Chris. M.
Oh no. I don't know. I still can't hear him. I don't.
Yeah, Chris, still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I was on the wrong mic. Hi, Chris. Good to see you again.
Yes.
Chris was a guest on Hit Parade the Bridge a couple months ago. It was a pleasure to have him. This time, going through your presentation, the thing that made my ears ring a little bit was when you talked about anomalous, or let's call it, I think you used the word fraudulent data. I think when we were up to the 70s. Um, I have certainly in my own studies encountered data that I consider fishy, eyebrow raising. I wonder if you caught anything systemic that, there's like an era of the charts that you think is particularly wacky.
Yeah, I think it's the mid 70s. I don't know if you can see. Can you see
Yeah,
my whole screen?
yeah, we see.
Yeah, we're watching what you're pulling up right now.
Okay. Yeah, this is another chart from that era. And this is the average descent down the charts when a song loses its number one spot. So
Hmm.
you can see from 60 to like 72. Usually a song is just falling from one to two when it falls out of the top spot. And then there's just this huge fall. And you see all of these examples where like I think You Haven't Done Nothing by Stevie Wonder, it falls from like number one to number 14. And that didn't really happen at the time. And it does seem to be correlated with the chart tenure of this man, Bill Wardlow, who I was reading some documentation where people like were alleging that, you could call him up and if he was your friend, you'd shake the charts up a little in your favor. I can't remember the book name. It's about Casablanca Records. They claim to be involved in some shenanigans. This is where I saw it most readily, and I would say the pre-sound scan era.
Yep.
Things, as you know, changed dramatically during sound scan, but this was the time I most saw weirdness.
Yeah, it's funny. Having read the book Hitmen by Frederick Dannon, which
Yes.
goes deep and uncovers a lot of the shenanigans around payola, and specifically the 70s, 80s era of indie promoters, indie used in a very different way from the way we use the word indie today. The so called independent promoters who were basically gatekeepers for getting on radio stations. My impression was always that these rapid drops, you see them right through the early 80s, where
Yeah.
songs will drop out of the number one spot. Sometimes they'll do what you're describing in the 70s, where they go from 1 to 12 or 14. And sometimes you'll see them go 1, 2, 5, 12, and then they'll just plummet off the Hot 100 entirely, which beggars belief. I've always assumed it had something to do with the sort of collusion of independent promoters basically saying, well, we're done with that record. We have no need to report it to Billboard anymore. But I do wonder if Bill Wardlaw is another culprit.
Yeah,
He may be involved in the most infamous urban legend of the charts, which is that the reason why Baker Street by Jerry Rafferty in
yeah.
1978 never got to number one was that supposedly somebody slipped something to Bill Wardlaw and told him not to put it at number one because Andy Gibbs' Shadow Dancing needed a seventh week at number one. This story has been repeated among chart nerds for decades. So
Yes.
who knows?
Yeah, I've come across that tale too. Poor Jerry Rafferty. And I came across Bill Wardlow's name initially in that book Hitman, which is a wonderful book.
Yeah, great read for it. I mean, it's now a 35-year-old book. It actually predates the SoundScan era, but it is still to this day the best book, the best expose I've ever read on sort of the dirty business of the record industry and some of the mechanics of how payola actually worked. Not
Yeah.
just, oh, it was all filthy. It was like it actually kind of walks you through some of the mechanics of it, which is helpful.
All right.
Cool,
Bill
thank you.
Anyway,
Wardlow maybe uh, having some friend or family member in our YouTube's comment down the road here. Have to see how that all plays out. Keep you posted. All right. No one is required to bring an expose to their question, but Charlie Thompson, the floor is yours.
Thanks. No hidden agenda. I'm just curious. I tend to favor YouTube over other streaming platforms just because it seems more crowdsourced. But I was just curious if there's any place we can stream all of these in one place?
Maria, so I put together a playlist on Spotify, and then I was intending to make it on other platforms, but the days are short. Though I can after I can send a link around. There are like these playlist transfer services that are usually free, and they'll just transfer like a playlist from Spotify to YouTube or Apple Music or whatever you use.
Sure.
I think that's the best option. But I would
Thank-
look on YouTube. I wouldn't be surprised if someone's made like a number one hits playlist.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Ian Balfour.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Um, I was wondering if you'd looked into the subspecies of cover songs that become number one hits, and if you turned up anything of interest. Like, it seems to be quite a spectrum from obscure original to big number one hit, or like in Tainted Love, or number one original to number one hit, like Killing Me Softly. Not that there's a formula to go from original to number one cover, but was that of interest to you?
Oh, yes. Uh, I would say a relatively big interest. One, not exactly what you're talking about, but this graphic I track. This is one I'm actually writing later in the book about the rise of sampling. But one thing I track in this is what I'm calling quoting other songs, which I think are covers, samples, and interpolations. And one thing I talk about extensively is the decline of cover songs, not just at the top of the charts, but like on the charts generally, where you can see back in the 60s. I mean, 30% of number one hits were cover songs, whereas I think the last cover to get to number one was the
Lady
cover of,
Marmalade.
yes, from, oh my God, what's the movie? Moulin Rouge. So super, super rare these days. I don't really have any uh, super f- super fun facts about cover songs other than the fact that they don't really happen that much near the top of the charts. I think the closest recently was last year. 2 years ago, Luke Combs covered Tracy Chapman's Fast Car, and I think it got stuck at number two for a bunch of weeks. It never ended up getting to number one. Um, though Chris Molanphy may know more about that.
Yeah, no, I actually did an episode of Hit Parade about cover songs, and it was agonizing for fans of cover songs because Fast Car would have been the first cover song to go to number one in literally 22 years between the Moulin Rouge song and Fast Car, and it got stuck at number two for something like 8 weeks. So, yeah, we came close, but no cigar.
Yeah, it is one of the more interesting trends, and I do talk about it a couple times. Is like, why don't people still cover songs, but popular artists don't cover songs in the same way they used to? I think that's a very fascinating trend, which doesn't exactly answer your question, but I
No,
hope that was
thanks a lot.
interesting.
Although there seems to be some difference between covering when performing live and then covering for recording. I think the latter is much rarer. But
Totally, totally. I mean, yeah, artists definitely still cover stuff in concert, and
yeah,
I think I joke in the book at some point, like if you search any song on YouTube, you will turn up 10 million covers of it, um, but not really on the charts.
yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Let's bring in Jose Galvez.
Yes, thank you very much. Amazing work. I would like to know, maybe I missed a point at the start of the presentation because I wasn't there at the beginning, but why did you started in the year 1958? Do you have any reasons for that?
Yeah, sort of I guess a somewhat silly reason. The Billboard Hot 100, which is Billboard's current pop chart that exists, was started on August 4th, 1958. So that felt
Mhm.
like a good place to start listening. There are a couple points in the book, and I think some like this chart, for example, goes back further. And the way I did that is Billboard had charts before the Hot 100. I believe
Mhm.
before August 58, I looked at their best-selling retail records chart. But yeah, I mean, it just arbitrarily chosen as a start place because that's when someone at Billboard magazine decided to start their currently existing pop chart. So if it started earlier, I would have listened earlier. But yeah, that's the reason.
Okay, maybe I can add another question related to that. Do you have any insights on the methodology of Billboard in the late 80s, 50s, or how they
Yeah.
got to these numbers?
Yeah, so before, let me show the chart here that has it. In 91, the charts became more quote unquote scientific in that every time something was purchased at a store, when the barcode was scanned, that
Hmm.
purchase was immediately sent to Billboard. So the charts became more accurate. Before that, my understanding is it was a survey method. So Billboard would just call a representative sample of stores and be like, hey, what's selling, and then the person would tell them what's selling, and
Hmm.
they would use some sort of formula to decide based on that what was the most popular record. But they were also tracking some other sources like radio. So I think they would do the same thing. They would call radio stations and be like, "What do you have in heavy rotation?" And they would use
Hmm.
some magical formula to put it all together. I don't know specifically what the formula was back then. I don't think anyone does, but well, actually, there is probably someone there's some people that have been at Billboard for a long time. But these days, everything is automated. In my day job, I interface with people at Billboard pretty regularly, and it's all automated collection. Now streaming is the biggest component, but they're
Hmm.
still tracking physical sales and radio play and all that stuff.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Nicole Bimonte.
Sure. Hi. Thanks so much. This is such interesting work, and I'm glad you're doing it. So, I kind of have two questions. One is I was wondering about the sonic profiles
Oh
graph
yeah.
and what you looked at to determine those. I think instrumentalness and acousticness are pretty self-explanatory, but I'm wondering about the others. Is energy like some combination of rhythmic density and tempo and dynamics maybe? Or I'm just wondering about what are the musical factors you looked at for those other three categories?
So
In the
the
sonic profile.
Yeah, so the boring answer here is those are all this is all just data that is computed by Spotify. And I believe what you're describing I would have to go look at the documentation. I actually don't remember exactly what they take into account, but I am pretty sure with energy, exactly what you're guessing is what they take into account. And they just compute it as a score between 0 and 100 for all of these things. Where acousticness, as you say, is more obvious as like something has a score of 100 on the acousticness scale, it would be that the Spotify system is relatively certain that the song is acoustic. Whereas, happiness, danceability, energy, those are a bit more amorphous, but they function the same way, and it's a 0 to 100 scale. But yeah, I'm happy to go pull that documentation afterwards. I just don't remember exactly what they are looking at, but it's all from Spotify.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah. So if I dug enough into Spotify, they must explain that somewhere in their documentation.
Yeah, yeah, I know where it is. I can send a link before everyone logs off.
That would be great. And the other thing I was wondering about, this is a much more general question, but like what's the balance of the graphs in the book on sort of like metadata, sort of like external kind of social and cultural kind of factors versus like specifically musical elements, like the graph of key changes?
That's a good question. I I would say that the demographic stuff is not super common. There are like two or three points in the book where I talk about that. Something as I think the key change one is like the most quote unquote technical musical stuff you're going to get in the book. But I would say a large majority of the charts are about some sort of metadata quality about the song themselves that is not necessarily related to something musical like a key change, whether that be what's the genre of this song or uh, what's the structure of this song, stuff like that. I would say that probably accounts for, I would guess, about half the charts. But I'd have to look specifically. I don't know if Caileigh has any insight there. Um,
It's like a pretty big mix because there's also, I'd say, a good handful of them touch on like how technology was shaping trends, um, and also just like, I don't know, different cultural trends. It is like a pretty wide mix.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Joe Mabel.
Right. So a very different question. 3 years of listening. Anything you hadn't heard before that you fell in love with? Anything you hope never to hear again in your life?
Oh yeah. Every time I talk about this book, I joke that my goal of writing this is just to convince people that they should be listening to Want Ads by Honeycomb, which I think is criminally underrated, unbelievable song, seems to have left very little cultural footprint, was a number one in the 70s. I was born in 1995, so I mean I was before I was born, I mean there were tons of number ones I was not familiar with. Uh Stuff I don't want to hear. Also lots of stuff. There's a lot of weird novelty songs I think from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Mr. Custer by Larry Verne, The Streak by Ray Stevens. I don't know if I'd go out of my way to listen to those again. But generally I enjoyed the journey. I mean, even when I was listening to a song that I was like, man, this is horrible. I enjoyed the act of going and listening to it and trying to learn about it. But there's, as I stress in the book, I think there's good and bad stuff in every decade, which is sort of beautiful in a way.
Thank you.
And in a neat bookend, we will wrap up with a question from Alex again.
Hello. I mean, just kind of a basic question about structure. We have all these like really interesting examples, but I'm sort of curious if you could speak to how you structured the book, how you sort of sought to sort of sequence all of the stuff, if it was like thematic or sequential, just sort of curious about how you turned this into like an arc.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I mentioned initially I didn't set out to write a book when I did this. I just was listening and then noticed some trends and I felt compelled to write about them. So the way it typically worked, and I describe this at the beginning of the book, is I call each chapter a quote era, but the eras are basically just I would stop when I felt like I had enough to say, which is, it doesn't seem like a very satisfying answer, but usually it was a period of like between 5 and 7 years of number one hits that I would cover. And within a given chapter, I would say there is an arc and there are ideas that work across chapter, but I think you could also read this book as like a collection of 13 essays there are ideas that are shared and connected. But I think there's more internal logic within each chapter than like a grand arc across every chapter. As I joke sort of at the end is like the day this book is published, it's already out of date because there's just been more number one hits. I mean, there's lucky for us, it's an endless tale, which is fun.
Thank you.
Um,
Awesome. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the questions. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Caileigh. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a punk rock roundup. The editors of a book on No Effects, 40 Years of Problematic Punk Provocations. Tyler Sonicson, work on progress on The Dead Milkmen, and an Eastern European band, initials JMKE, and a book about that by Brigitte Davidjens, To the Cold Land. So to the cold land we return you all, and say goodnight from Popular Music Books in Process.